I would like to now open the floor to the questions. Would you please state your name and if you wish to address the question to any particular panelist, and please be short and to the point, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Mohammed Nasr. I'm from Egypt and a member of the Standing Committee. I have a comment first and then a couple of questions. Thanks a lot for the panelists for the presentation. It is really very rich in information. But the comment is most, or if not all, the projects that the EBRD have mentioned are in the form of loans. So were these bankable projects, they're all in the form of loans? Loans. Within the climate sphere that we work on and the climate negotiations, adaptation and resilience were more in the form of grants, which is the GCF approach to the adaptation projects. So my question to the EBRD is, if those projects were not climate resilient, would still EBRD fund them? I mean, is there a special treatment for the climate resilient projects, preferential treatment, both in the form of concessional loans or specific rates, or it is applied across the board? It is a bankable project, so we just fund it. The second point was mentioned again by the Jeff and I think by the other colleague from the EBRD when he mentioned the issue of strategic program for climate resilience, which is a very important element. I believe the GCF is working on NAPS, supporting NAPS, National Adaptation Plans. But to have projects coming from the countries that are climate resilient, there should be some sort of incentive to the policymakers and the policy planners. Out of the climate sphere that we are all in, other policymakers and policy planners, they look at the feasibility of the money that is, or the finance that is coming in. So they will look on the lower rate, not even thinking of the climate dimension on it. So is there some sort of a cooperation or coordination from the EBRD with the national authorities to support them in having this strategic program for climate resilience? Something that the EBRD would provide similar to the GCF NAPS approach, or it is left to the countries to put their own priorities and come forward with bankable projects that could be funded? Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. We're going to take a couple of more questions for the first round. Gentleman in front, please.
Yeah, my name is Raegon Jung. I'm from Korea. I'm recommended by the Asian Group as a participant. But I've been involved in this climate negotiation for a long time as a Korean delegate. My question is regarding the, in the context of what was already asked by the first questioner, that I believe the GCF as the way the operation is based on the needs of the countries. But many of the multilateral development banks, it is based on, as was mentioned, by the bankability and the project feasibility. So it is, I'm not sure how the EBRD, like MDB, can evolve into a stage where their lending portfolio is based on the need of the countries rather than just the bankability from the banker's point of view. So this is a kind of a general comment. Second question is about the climate risks, which was mentioned by EBRD presentation there. How can you measure the climate risk? You mentioned that there's a mandatory request for disclosure, but is there standardized, emerging methodology to agree on the level of how to measure the risk of climate? I believe at the current stage of our knowledge, it's very challenging and very difficult. So how, this is an area I believe we all have to work, continue our work to come up with some kind of better knowledge on how to measure the climate risk. So this is an area I hope you have a reaction. How can we improve on that?
Thank you, and we take a third question before moving to the answer.
Thank you very much. I'm Raju Pandichatri. I'm from Nepal. Well, I think I do agree with the question what Mohammed raised earlier, but I have a very general question to Mary Alexander. Well, in these sessions, if you look, you talk quite a lot about the investments, and also in the upcoming sessions, it uses the word investments quite a lot. But I was just wondering that, are you looking for any kind of returns from these investments? And if it were returns, like in what form? Can you just unpack a little bit? Because as we know that with the growing impact of climate change, even normal infrastructures are becoming really expensive. And I think earlier Edith from Uganda referred this, how expensive the infrastructures are becoming, especially for LDC countries and other developing countries. So I'm just wondering, like, you know, when these words investment comes every time in the sessions, even in the upcoming sessions, I was just wondering what does the return would you mean, and then what in form, or if you could unpack that, would be helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're going to have a second round of questions in a moment, but first let's reply to these questions. I think that most of them were addressed to the EBRD, so please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Let me reply maybe to the general one, and then I will defer to my colleague on the more technical question. You know, the EBRD is owned by 67 shareholders, countries, and institutions, and we have to earn our profits then to be able to fulfill our mandate, which is to support countries in their transition. So when we look at a project, and especially an infrastructure project, we looked at different pillars. The first one is, of course, how does it fit with the government strategy, with the national priorities? The second one, and of course, how does it impact the economic development of the country? This is the first pillar. The second pillar is this investment sound? Is it financially viable? The EBRD, as opposed to some other multilateral development banks, do not provide concessional funding. We price at market, so we really align ourselves with the local market practices. And this is the third pillar. We have to be additional. We have to complement the local sources of financing that are available. We are not here to compete with local commercial banks. So when you take into account the three pillars, this is how we looked at projects. And of course, our returns have to be sufficient for us to be able to survive and to continue to exist. You know, we were created 26 years ago, initially to support the transition from the former USSR countries, and our shareholders didn't think that we would last very long, but then the world has changed, and we have actually, our core mandate has actually been revived significantly. So when we look at the projects, we can't provide direct concessional funding. However, because as I said, we have 67 shareholders, we are able to tap into to our donors, to our shareholders, and or to other donors like the GEF or the GCF or others to complement our funding. And this additional funding would actually bring something specific to the project. So the objective is not to have some continual funding, but actually to bring some expertise that will be financed by that additional money. So I think that's overall the answer to the two or three questions that are more general. An additional point: our financing is complemented by technical assistance and technical expertise. So, for instance, for micro or small projects, we put in place credit lines to financial institutions. Like we have in Morocco, we have launched the MORCEF credit line with a number of financial institutions, especially BMCE and BCP. And with this credit line is complemented by technical assistance to both the banks, so that they actually understand how to assess the sub-projects, but also to the end borrowers to be able to put forward a project that is environmental friendly, but also financially viable. So that's, I think, the specificity of the EBRD and the ability that we have to mobilize additional funding to our financing. Craig, would you like to answer the question on
Just to add briefly to Marie-Alexandre's answers, I'll make 2 quick points. I think the gentleman from Egypt and Nepal made some very interesting points, and I would say that they circle around the same issue, which is the question of strategic planning for investment in climate resilience. We know the topic of our discussion this week is mobilizing finance. We know that the investment needs for climate resilient infrastructure are absolutely huge. And I think the importance of strategic planning for climate resilient investment is that it helps us to look across the whole kind of ecosystem of different sources of finance. We have, for example, grant resources made available by bilateral donors, by climate finance mechanisms. We have concessional finance made available by some multilateral development banks. We have more commercially oriented non-concessional finance from other multilateral banks such as EBRD. And then we have private investment. So we have this kind of ecosystem of different sources of finance. And the question for mobilizing, around mobilizing finance for climate resilient investment is how can we optimize the way that we access the different parts of that ecosystem to really scale up good quality investment in climate resilient infrastructure? When is it appropriate to use grants? When is it appropriate to use concessional finance? When is it appropriate to bring in the private sector? And that, I think, comes back to this question of the importance of strategic planning and the need to have a conversation, to have a dialogue between governments, between international partners, between civil society, between private investors, to have that conversation to work out what is the most strategic way in which we can make the most effective use of these different types of finance and sources of finance. I was asked to be brief, so just one other quick point. The gentleman from Korea, I think, made a very, very important point about metrics. This was mentioned by the high-level speakers in the opening session. It's an extremely important point. We really do need to develop metrics for working out how we measure success, how we measure the impact of climate resilience investments, how we measure the level of climate vulnerability and the needs for these sorts of investments. There's a lot of discussion at the moment in various different fora on this topic, both in the development finance community and also in the commercial finance community as well. And I noticed that tomorrow on Thursday we have a session where this topic will be looked into in more depth. But it's a very important point. How do we measure success? How do we develop metrics? And hopefully tomorrow we'll have more time to talk about that.
Thank you. Very briefly, our other panelists, do you want to add anything? Yeah, please go ahead.
Sure. I think one of the issues that I think contributes to this discussion and ongoing dialogue is that how the global climate finance architecture can play a catalyst role in strategic development regarding the climate resilience infrastructure. And I can share some of the GCF experiences in this respect. First of all, GCF has looked into enhancing the readiness program for countries so they can use more readiness funds to prepare a strategic pipeline that deals more with resilience. And I think that is going to be one of the topics to be discussed at the next board meeting in Egypt, B18. Secondly, I think the catalyst financing really, what people often do not understand is that the catalyst financing means mixing of different sources of financing, so-called hybrid financing with concessional loans or concessional financing with more commercial financing, which we often do with EBRD and other accredited entities or MDBs. Thirdly, the use of innovative financing instruments is really, really important, and GCF has been externally looking into the guarantee instruments as to how do we can really bridge the viability gaps in financing infrastructure to achieve the target goals. So the viability gap is a gap between a commercial viability and actual technical viability necessary to make adaptation goals viable. So these are just some ideas. And finally, I think it is still not enough known that GCF can provide 0% interest rate loans for 40 years duration for the climate resilient financing that is more and more often used in hybrid approach to climate resilient infrastructure. Thank you.
Not much to add. I just wanted to pick up on the gentleman from Korea's point about how to measure climate risk, and it's something that the GEF has been outside of our adaptation portfolio. We've been thinking about how to ensure that the other investments we finance are resilient to climate risk. because we finance projects in climate mitigation, in chemicals and waste, in forestry, biodiversity. And our donors have been asking us to consider climate risk, and we've been wondering, do we need to develop in-house tools? What should we do? And we're actually very grateful to most of the agencies that we now work with, that we provide the funding through, have developed their own in-house screening mechanisms. You know, I think that possibly, and there hasn't been a decision on this, but possibly an expedient way forward for the GEF would be to rely on our agencies applying their own screening tools to all the projects across these various sectors. I'm not going to unpack, and I don't even know how to, about how they develop the screening tools and measure the climate risk, but for us, it's a fantastic boon that there's been so much activity in this area from our various agencies.
Thank you. We're running short of time, so I'm going to take 2 more questions if there are any from the left side of the room. Gentleman there, please.
Good morning, Edgar Cruz from Colombia. The point is that you are referring, and for all of you that are representative for funding sources, okay, it is clear that projects will cost more because of climate, because you need additional investment. And then the point is, you could still have an investment gap, because to make, for example, the project bankable, you said, okay, I adapt to some level. But perhaps that was not the level that was really needed. So I just want to ask, what is your perspective on residual risk that can be still, even if you apply some level of adaptation measures to projects? So what is your perspective of how to balance what you do on adaptation and still the residual risk that you can have after the project is prepared and implemented? Thank you.
Thank you. And I take the second question, gentleman sitting next there.
Yep. Hello, my name is Alfredo Redondo from C40 Cities, and kind of thinking a little bit on the local government and regional government's perspective, but in general, what I wanted to know from GEF, also GCF, in general, I know that there has been talking about bankability of the projects, and thinking from the city officials or regional government officials' perspective, that they have to try and apply for this, and it's such a lot of work, it's so much work, and they never really understand well the formats and what it means to have a resilience project being bankable. What are the tools, or what are the mechanisms you have to offer support for these processes? I have seen a lot of really good projects and really good ideas that need this funding, but then they get to this wall and they just don't know how to get through it. I think this kind of help would really increase their chances of implementing really good projects. Just a little comment aside on the trying to measure climate impacts and how we do that. Some international organizations, just as C40, but also in partnership with ICLE, 100RC, and the other actors around there, and the European Commission, we have been working strongly in the Global Covenant of Mayors, which has some measures of how we receive their information, their reports, how they measure climate impacts, how they measure their own actions, and the impact these actions can have in building more resilience in cities. So I hope this extends furthermore. But yeah, my questions is just the first. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to start from our panelists, the GCF?
Let me take the heat for time being. It's an interesting question. I mean, the last time I think I heard the issue of the local government not being able to raise bankable projects in resilience was, I think, at the Habitat conference, where it was very clearly suggested that we have issue with decentralized finance. The issue of decentralized finance, municipal finance, is a more structural issue with cities. And essentially, the problem is that you do have clever ideas and clever project proposals, but they are technically okay, but they do not have a conduit to finance. So one of the intervention areas is to try to understand how do we make more conduit to finance generally for projects in the cities. and then obviously for a resilient finance, for climate resilient infrastructure even more. I would just give you one example. When you look into the drainage problems in bigger cities, in urban development, you see only potentially a technical problem or how much the infrastructure is going to cost. But nobody looks really seriously into the social issues, because the drainage always involves informal communities and resettlements. And that's where the major problems start. And so the issue with adaptation finance in general is that it requires far more cross-sectoral capacities of the government in planning and executing the resilience projects. So they are more complex, they are more time-consuming, they need more technical assistance and preparatory funds, yeah? And eventually they are hitting the problem of decentralized finance, the fact that cities cannot raise the finances without involvement of national government. So this is just a complexity of the climate resilience finance that I think we're going to tackle during this forum.
Thanks for all of those questions. I'll go sequentially, so I'll start with the gentleman from Colombia's question, which was about how to find the level of resilience needed when making infrastructure investments. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, so yes, and that goes to the point I made earlier, that it's a tricky area because we don't want to get locked into something in a situation where we're in a world which is uncertain. We are beginning to understand how climate is changing. There are still uncertainties involved, and we can't, especially the further out you go in time, and the problem with infrastructure is that it is very long-lasting. Some infrastructure is built to last 50 or 70 years, and we honestly can't say what the climate will be at that time for a particular area. So I think the trick is to try to build in a way that can be incremental and allow flexibility and allow adjustment and not lock ourselves into something. On the question from C40, from the Jeff perspective, my own reference to bankability was actually with regards to what I see as a lack of enthusiasm for financing ecosystem-based solutions at large scale, which I think can go a long way towards assisting infrastructure in doing its job and promoting resilience for communities. And when those ecosystem services fail, that's when we really need to rely more maybe on hard solutions. And so that's kind of where I was trying to point at what the issue is and trying to tease out what are some of the reasons for perhaps where we don't see such an active pursuit of investment in ecosystem-based solutions. And I think part of it is that it's an area of a lot of ongoing research as well, and it's difficult to quantify exactly what the profit will be coming out of one of those projects, especially when so many of the benefits are, not financial. But with regard to city resilience, the Jeff is, for example, working on a very large program. It's a $150 million grant program across 23 cities on sustainable cities, where we are working with local governments to try and bring together the various sectors that need to be involved, work with the municipalities, with other actors, and we understand that this city-level resilience just needs a different way of doing business. And we're hoping to try and get to that through the program.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to the audience. I think it was very active first session, and it's really clearly getting our landscape being presented in a very good context. So I have to close the first session now. We have a coffee break.